Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and these are my latest models, saved from the purgatory of grey. And what I mean by that is that sometime, many months ago, I started painting them, and then got distracted by other models, and just recently I found them and finished them off. I did, sensibly, take some footage of the process, and this video will therefore have some old and new recordings mixed in. And starting with the oldest of them, I had a look at the parts for these little ships and how they go together. These first are a pair of orc ships mounted on a single base to be a rabble squadron. You might notice some of the fine details of this have been broken away in transport. As I bought these second-hand, they've been posted around a bit. But there are also some air bubbles from casting. I mentioned in my older videos that the Armada ships have some extremely small details that don't always come out so well with the resin casting method. Or, to be honest, any model kit of this size. For the orcs I don't mind too much at all, because a little damage here or there is just free character. That's battle damage, that is. So onto the front of the hull they have a pair of spearheads sticking out. Some optimistic ramming spikes is my guess, but they glue into place nicely with a nice big secure keying block. The sail for these are a single piece, and again a square keying block so that they line up properly. But for the moment I'll keep the sail separate for painting. I also have here the Bacillian equivalent. These are a sloop squadron, again 2 to a base. The hull here is relatively smooth, just with the sculpted wooden planking. The mainsail and headsail are separate, with the mainsail keying into the hull quite nicely, but the headsail kind of has some very small, not so much pegs as little bumps, and these 2 protrusions at the top that just about hold on to the mainmast. For armament, the human ships have these super adorable tiny little cannons. Most of the cannons in the Armada line are moulded onto the hulls, but this one is a separate piece. And I just want a whole bag of just these little cannons because they are just that cute. As out of focus as it may be, I glued the cannons down, and just the same as the orc ships, I kept the sails separate for painting. And to hold them to my painting handle, I put the hulls onto some spare square bases that I had lying about. And with that I got stuck in painting by looking at the Bacillian sails. The other Bacillian ships that I painted all those millions of seconds ago, I started with a light brown base coat and mixed white into it to build up a highlight of white. By adding more and more layers with proportionally more white, I end up with this kind of dirty white fabric effect that I quite like for the sails. It's possibly not an ideal way of doing it, but it's very fun, very easy, and compared to most of the time when you paint white, because white doesn't cover well by itself, it does look relatively good. Jumping forwards many months, I'm looking at how far I got with the orc ships. Now it seems to me that I had most of the hull complete, but I can't find any of the old recordings for it. The recipe here is a simple dark brown base coat, dark silver for the metal, and then a brown wash all over. And whilst I'm relatively happy with how that looks, I wanted to add just a little bit of extra detail to bring out all of the sculpting of the models. And so, very carefully with a light brown, I edge highlighted some of the wooden planking of the ship. Not every plank, just a few here and there to give some definition to the fine detail in the sculpt. As I have the light brown out, I base coated all of the horns and tusks around the ship, which, just like the sails on the human ship, I highlighted up into white. This time with only a couple of layers and the brush strokes all the way down the length. I was hoping to get those kind of lines that you sometimes get in tusks. However, these are very small, and so I'm not sure how well that came out. But with those little minor finishing touches to the hull, I felt like I could work on the sail, and what better way to hold onto it than to glue it onto the ship. And hey, look at that, it still fits. As my orc ships have different coloured sails, I'll follow that scheme and pick a different one for the rabbles, and I ended up choosing another colour that doesn't coat particularly well, yellow. "But Ed, you're not painting yellow, that's orange," I hear nobody shout. And they would have been right, because just like white, yellow is notorious for covering poorly, so painting something underneath and highlighting up into yellow in a few layers gives that yellow the chance for decent coverage and some opportunity for some nice highlighting effects. I actually went quite heavy with the old contrast, leaving the underside of the folds a fairly solid orange, where the upper side of the folds got many layers of mixed orange and yellow, all the way up to a couple of layers of pure yellow to really brighten that up. And with those many layers of yellow done, the Orc Rabble Squadron is complete. Back to the Bacillian ships then, and just how far did I get last time? Well, the sails are relatively good, just need to fill in that sigil, but the hull needs most of my time here, pretty much only having a light brown base coat with a brown wash. Clearly the coverage wasn't total, so I went around with my light brown to fill in the gaps, but also to give a similar edge highlight or kind of framing to certain parts of the sloops in a similar way to the Orc Rabble Squadron. I also gave the cannon's barrels some metallic, and whilst I was on the subject of metallic, I realised I actually do have a good gold paint these days. And so the box art version of the Bacillian ships with lots of gold accents was something I could achieve much more easily. And so I went round and gave a gold edge to the sloops. Kind of strangely, the gold bits on the smallest of ships is suitably less ostentatious than the bigger ships, but it still looks pretty nice. And as that's all I really wanted to do to the hull, just kind of clean it up and finish off those details, I added the sails. And as I mentioned before, the mainsail goes down in place with maybe a little too much superglue, but the headsail holds in place on the prow, the top of the mainmast, and supposedly the little dimple on the deck, but I seem to have missed with both of my sloops. Anyway, let's touch up that Bacillian sun, and as I'm in the mood for yellow it seems, let's continue that theme. This time instead of orange, I'll stick with a light brown base coat and jump up the mix into yellow much more quickly in fewer layers. And what this will do is give me a lighter value of yellow, but will still keep that level of saturation. Now it didn't take that many layers, but it is still yellow, so it was quite a few. Thankfully this is only a very small area to paint, so it didn't take too long to get the sloops finished. And here they are. Now I did show a video on how I do the resin bases for the Armada ships, and I'll post a link to that somewhere, so long as somebody reminds me to post a link somewhere. The Orc Rabbles came out really nicely. However, I think I still like the Blood Runner with the blue sails here a little bit more. If I was able to play this game more, if I had an opponent to play against, I think a whole fleet of Blood Runners would actually be a lot of fun, and maybe with a couple more Rabble Squadrons as escorts. The Bacillian sloops also fit nicely with my previous ships, but this time I think they are actually my favourites, and I'd be happy to run, well, quite a few of them if I could, especially as they don't take long to paint. Although of course having some larger ships in your fleet is probably a sensible idea. None of these ships are painted to an expert level, and they don't need to be. I enjoyed finishing them off and getting them out of the pile of grey, or the pile of half painted lost at the back of a shelf. So do let me know what you think in the comment section below, but for now, I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.